Hello everyone, the film I have chosen to do for this assignment is Battleship Potemkin. It's a Soviet film made in 1925 and its director is Sergei Eisenstein. So who was Sergei Eisenstein? Eisenstein was a Soviet film director and film theorist, and he was a pioneer in the theory of practice and montage. His most celebrated movies are Battleship Potemkin, Strike, October, and also Alexander Nevsky and Ivan the Terrible. Sergei was born in Latvia and he studied at Petrograd Institute of Civil Engineering. In 1918, Eisenstein enlisted in the Red Army and served in the Bolshevik Revolution. In the 1920s, Eisenstein went to Moscow, where he began his career in theater, and that was when he started making films. Eisenstein also worked abroad in countries like America and Mexico. In the 1930s, he returned to USSR and made one of his greatest films, Alexander Nevsky. The three main actors in Battleship Potemkin are Antonov, Barksy, and Alexandrov. Alexandrov was named a People's Artist of the USSR and a hero of socialist labor. The other two actors didn't achieve anything significant, and they were not prominent at all. What is Battleship Potemkin about? First of all, we have to place Battleship Potemkin in its historical context. In 1905, Russian people witnessed Russia's first revolution. Thousands of people were dissatisfied with Tsar Nicholas II policies and demanded radical reforms. They wanted a democratic Russia. Moreover, humiliating defeat to Japan in 1904 only undermined Tsar's authority and increased people's suspicions of him. Therefore, in 1905, a peaceful demonstration was held in front of the Tsar's residence. The petition people carried showed that they just wanted Nicholas II to help them. It was a peaceful demonstration led by Father Gapon, and it was attacked by the Cossacks, and this became known as Bloody Sunday. More crucially, it led to strikes and riots across the country. Workers and soldiers got together and mutinied against the Tsarist regime. Sailors on the Battleship Potemkin started rebellion against the officers too. Therefore, the Battleship Potemkin mutiny was one of the riots which happened during the 1905 revolution. The 1920s also must be considered. 1920s was a golden age for Soviet cinema, and communist leaders regarded cinema as a especially useful tool in securing Bolshevik propaganda objectives. The government realized the value of silence in films, and one can notice that Battleship Potemkin is a silent movie. Audience don't actually hear characters having conversations, and there's no sound, and this makes it easier to understand and watch. Also, we can learn certain aspects of 1920s Soviet cinema, and we can see how it was developing. Battleship Potemkin has stereotypical heroes and villains. There aren't a lot of individual characters, and instead, this film is essentially about Potemkin crew fighting against their officers. It's about heroic sailors fighting against an established system, cruel Russian Tsarist officers. There are still some individual characters like Veremchuk, but they act as members of social classes. For example, he represents Russian sailors. So much more focus is on the people rather than on individuals. The year of 1925 marked the 20th anniversary of Russia's first revolution, and Soviet Central Executive Committee had decided to put up a number of performances celebrating this significant event in Russian history. The government also wanted to make a film about the 1905 events, and Eisenstein was told to direct it. Battleship Potemkin was a tribute to those revolutionaries who took part in the 1905 revolution. It was a piece of propaganda. Another reason for making this film was Eisenstein to test his theory of montage. Therefore, Potemkin is based on a real event, and the film is broken up into 5 parts. The first part is called Men and Maggots, and it shows sailors being forced to eat rotten meat. When the Potemkin crew complains about the quality of meat, Doctor inspects the meat but says that it's perfectly fine for consumption and ends the discussion. This angers sailors even more, and they choose to eat bread instead. The second part is drama on the deck. Those sailors who refuse to eat meat are accused of insubordination, and the firing squad comes onto a deck. The officer orders them to shoot on sailors, but they refuse, and an uprising begins. Troops outnumber officers, and many officers are thrown overboard, and the doctor is thrown into the ocean as food for fish. Part 3 is a dead man calls for justice. The charismatic leader Vakilinchuk is killed, and Potemkin arrives at the port of Odessa. People of Odessa are saddened by the death of such charismatic men. and they demonstrate their support for the Potemkin crew. People are also starting to mobilize against the government, and number of policemen is increased because of that. Part 4 is the Odessa Steps. This is the best known sequence of the film, and it shows Tsarist troops shooting at a crowd of peaceful, unarmed citizens, including children. Soldiers just keep marching towards people, ignoring calls for peace. Many are killed, including a mother and her little baby. The last part shows battleship Potemkin sailing away from Odessa with the red flag. Are there any interesting scenes in Battleship Potemkin? As I have mentioned earlier, the Odessa Steps scene is arguably one of the greatest and most interesting scenes in the film. Firstly, this scene in particular demonstrates the horrors of the Tsarist regime. The audience can see how cruel and how heartless Tsarist soldiers are. They just start shooting at people, and the victims include an older woman, a young boy with his mother, a student in uniform, and a teenage schoolgirl. Secondly, in this scene, Eisenstein applied his theory of montage. He believed that film editing should be more abrupt and more quick. He argued that this would connect the audience more closely with characters and make films look more real. He wanted audience to feel more sympathy for the characters. And this way he revolutionized cinematography. In fact, the Odessa Steps massacre never actually happened. There were mass demonstrations in Odessa, but there was no Odessa Steps shooting, and definitely not as it was shown in the film. However, due to Eisenstein editing techniques, he made it look so real that many actually believed this was a true event, but it never actually happened. Another interesting episode in the film is the death of Vikilimchuk. This is a great example of individual versus the community. One of the aspects of communist cinema was that an individual had to be sacrificed for the greater good of the community, and often Bolshevik leaders were killed. Vikilimchuk is a sailor, and therefore he's a working class, and he represents Bolshevik. He's the one who wants to change the current Russian government. This helps audience to understand that communists stood up against the tyrannical Tsarist regime. Another episode that I found quite interesting was when sailors were ordered to eat meat covered in lice. Audience can see that conditions were pretty awful, and there was no respect for soldiers. It shows how badly Russian troops were treated, and that Russian army was in very poor conditions, and this was one of the reasons of 1905 uprisings. What is also interesting about Battleship Potemkin is that it is a silent film. The silent era lasted from approximately 1875 to 1935. There are no dialogues in the film, and actors gesture much more than in a non-silent film. Therefore, this makes Battleship Potemkin a much more emotional film, and it connects the audience much more. Therefore, audience feel more sympathy for characters, and they feel much more involved. And as you can see, audience don't actually hear actors speak, and it's just silent and music playing over what actors are saying. How good is Battleship Potemkin as a source for historians? One can argue that this film is not a great historical source. First is there is no real footage, everything is staged, and there are just actors in the film. Therefore, Eisenstein reconstructs history, and this makes it not a very reliable source. Second of all, it is a dramatized version of the Potemkin Rebellion. The Odessa Steps sequence is an excellent example of that, as it had never happened. There were mass demonstrations in Odessa, but there was no Odessa Steps massacre. It was invented by Eisenstein in order to create more sympathy with the audience. Third of all, Potemkin arguably shows an idealistic reality. The fact that the whole crew united against officers might not have happened in real life. And it is pretty much an idealistic version of the revolution. On the other hand, Potemkin is good in helping historians understand how Soviet cinema was developing in the 1920s. This film helps one understand more clearly certain aspects of Soviet propaganda, like heroes versus villains. Like there is less attention on individual characters, but instead more focused on groups. This film is about Potemkin sailors uprising, and therefore the main focus is on certain groups of individuals, sailors. Battleship Potemkin crew stood up against an established system and are fighting for the better future. Hence, Velikimchuk is an individual hero, but he represents class stereotype working class, Bolshevik sailor. He is killed for the greater good of others, and this shows that there will be a better life. Therefore, individual characters act as members of social classes. It can also be a good source for historians because it helps understand what the Soviet government at the time wanted to achieve. This film shows that propaganda was important for the Russian government, as they wanted people to believe in communism and see 1905 and 1917 revolutions as great events. The film justifies both revolutions and shows that they were necessary and they did great things to Russian people. The director shows the cruelty of Tsarist regime and how awful life was for Russian people before revolution changed lives for the better. Therefore, this could be a valuable source for historians, as it would show that through cinema, Soviet government wanted to legitimize Russian revolution and make people believe that it was necessary and that it changed things for good. Soviet leaders also wanted its people to believe in a brighter future. By showing harsh conditions of Tsarist regime, the government wanted to install hopes in lives of Russian people and put up with present conditions.